At Chicago O'Hare Airport, a little girl sat alone near Gate B17, holding a sleeping toddler against her chest, while thousands of travelers rushed past without noticing anything was wrong. Flight announcements echoed through the crowded terminal. Suitcases rattled across the polished floor. Businessmen hurried toward connecting flights with coffee cups in their hands while exhausted parents dragged crying children through security lines. The airport was loud, busy, alive. But in the middle of all that movement sat a little girl, so heartbreakingly still that once people finally noticed her later, many would say the same thing. She looked like someone had already given up on being rescued. The toddler sleeping against her shoulder couldn't have been older than 2 years old. His tiny sneakers dangled above the airport chair, while one small hand clutched the sleeve of her oversized gray hoodie. Every few seconds, the little girl adjusted the blanket wrapped around him before glancing nervously toward the boarding gate nearby. Not hopefully anymore, just automatically, like her body hadn't yet accepted what her heart already knew. Their mother wasn't coming back. 27 minutes earlier, a tired-looking woman with blonde hair had crouched in front of the little girl beside the boarding line and whispered something into her ear while fighting back tears. Witnesses would later remember how exhausted she looked. Not drunk, not angry, just emotionally destroyed. Then she kissed the toddler's forehead, handed the little girl a worn backpack, and said 5 words that would later haunt millions of viewers online after airport footage leaked months afterward. "Take care of your brother." Then she stood up, turned around, and boarded a flight to Phoenix without her children. No screaming, no dramatic scene, no final goodbye. She simply walked away. And somehow, that made it even more heartbreaking. The little girl waited anyway. Children always wait longer than adults think they will. She waited while passengers boarded, waited while airport employees closed the gate doors, waited while the plane slowly pushed away from the terminal outside the giant windows. And even after the aircraft disappeared into the gray afternoon sky, she still sat there clutching her little brother tightly against her chest like she believed waiting patiently enough might somehow bring her mother back. What nobody inside that airport understood yet was that this little girl had already been abandoned emotionally long before her mother boarded that plane. And the man who finally noticed her sitting there alone was completely unprepared for how much that moment would change his own life too. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our videos. Because out of everyone moving through that terminal that afternoon, only one person stopped walking when he heard the toddler start crying. Daniel Mercer. At 42 years old, Daniel was the kind of wealthy man most people only recognized from magazine covers and financial interviews. The billionaire aviation investor owned luxury properties across 3 states, flew privately whenever possible, and spent most of his life buried inside business meetings, airport lounges, and corporate negotiations. Newspapers described him as brilliant but emotionally distant. Employees described him as demanding. Online articles called him cold. And honestly, after losing his wife in a car accident 7 years earlier, maybe all those descriptions were true. Grief had a way of hollowing people out slowly. After his wife died, Daniel stopped attending family holidays, stopped answering personal calls, stopped allowing himself to get emotionally close to anyone because losing people hurt too much once you understood how quickly life could take them away. Work became easier than emotions. Airports became easier than home. And somewhere over the years, Daniel Mercer became the kind of man who could sit beside strangers every day without truly noticing them anymore. Until he noticed her. The toddler's crying pulled Daniel's attention toward the corner seating area near Gate B17, just as he stepped out of the private airport lounge carrying a cup of untouched coffee. At first, he assumed their mother was nearby. Most people would. But then he noticed the little girl trying to calm the boy with an almost empty baby bottle while repeatedly glancing toward the empty boarding gate beside them. Something about it immediately felt wrong. Daniel slowed his steps. The little girl looked exhausted. Not temporarily tired. Deeply exhausted. The kind of exhaustion children only carried after spending too long worrying about things children should never have to worry about. Her blonde hair looked unwashed. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes. And even from several feet away, Daniel could see how protective she was over the little boy curled against her chest. Then he saw her secretly wipe tears away before the toddler could notice she was crying. That moment hit him harder than he expected. because suddenly she didn't look like a child sitting in an airport anymore. She looked like someone trying desperately to become an adult before she was ready. Daniel stared for another few seconds while travelers continued passing around them without stopping. Part of him considered walking away. It would have been easier, safer emotionally. Airports were full of situations that weren't his responsibility. But then the toddler whimpered again, and the little girl whispered softly while rocking him against her shoulder. "It's okay, Mason," she murmured shakily. "I'm still here. Still here. Not, we're okay. Not, mom's coming back. Just, I'm still here." Daniel walked toward them before he could change his mind. "Hey there," he said gently. The little girl looked up so suddenly that her entire body tensed protectively around the toddler. Daniel immediately noticed fear in her eyes. Not ordinary nervousness. Real fear. The kind children develop after learning adults can disappear without warning. Daniel crouched slightly beside the airport chair so he wouldn't seem intimidating. "Is your mom nearby?" he asked softly. The little girl hesitated. Her lips parted slightly like she wanted to answer, but didn't know how. Finally, she looked toward the empty gate again before whispering words Daniel Mercer would never forget for the rest of his life. She got on the plane. Daniel frowned slightly. "Without you?" The little girl nodded once. A heavy silence settled between them while the sounds of the airport echoed around nearby terminals. Daniel glanced toward the departure screen above the gate. Flight 417 to Phoenix. Departed 23 minutes ago. A cold feeling settled slowly into his chest. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Emma." "And your little brother?" "Mason." Daniel nodded slowly while trying to process what he was hearing. "How long have you two been sitting here alone?" Emma shrugged weakly. Then, after several seconds of silence, she quietly added something that made Daniel feel his heart sink instantly. She said she couldn't be our mom anymore. Daniel didn't answer immediately. For several seconds, he simply stared at the little girl sitting beside him while those words settled heavily inside his chest. She said she couldn't be our mom anymore. Emma said it quietly, calmly almost, like she still hadn't fully processed what the sentence actually meant. But Daniel had lived long enough to recognize pain hidden beneath silence. And the way her small fingers tightened protectively around Mason told him everything he needed to know. Children blamed themselves for abandonment far more often than adults realized. Daniel carefully sat down beside her, while travelers continued moving through the terminal around them, completely unaware that two children had just lost the only parent they had left. "How old are you, Emma?" he asked softly. 9. "And Mason's 2? She nodded. The toddler stirred sleepily against her shoulder before resting his head beneath her chin again. Daniel noticed how naturally Emma adjusted the blanket around him without even thinking about it. She'd clearly been taking care of him for a long time. Too long. "Have you eaten today?" Daniel asked. Emma immediately nodded too quickly, but at that exact moment, her stomach growled loudly enough for both of them to hear. The little girl looked embarrassed instantly. Daniel almost smiled sadly. "I'll take that as a no." A few minutes later, he returned carrying 2 sandwiches, apple juice, crackers, warm milk for Mason, and a stuffed brown teddy bear he grabbed near the cashier without really thinking about it. Emma stared at the teddy bear for several seconds after he handed it to her. Daniel expected her to hug it immediately like most children would. Instead, she carefully placed it beside Mason. That small gesture nearly broke him. Even now, she was still putting her little brother first. Mason finally woke up properly once Emma helped him drink the warm milk. The toddler blinked sleepily around the crowded terminal before clinging tighter to his sister the moment he noticed Daniel sitting nearby. "It's okay," Emma whispered gently while rubbing his back. "He helped us. Us. Not me." Daniel noticed every little thing about them now. The worn backpack near Emma's feet. The way Mason's tiny sneakers were slightly too small. The faded cartoon bandage wrapped around his thumb. These children hadn't just been abandoned today. They'd been struggling for a while. "What happened to your dad?" Daniel asked carefully after a while. Emma lowered her eyes immediately. "He got sick." Daniel stayed quiet. The little girl swallowed hard before continuing softly. "Mom tried taking care of him at home because hospital bills were too expensive." Her voice cracked slightly near the end. "But then he died last winter." Daniel looked away briefly toward the runway outside the massive airport windows. He understood grief. Understood what losing someone could do to people emotionally. But abandoning children? That part he still couldn't understand. "She wasn't always like this." Emma suddenly whispered. Daniel looked back at her. Your mom. Emma nodded slowly. After Daddy died, everything changed. She adjusted Mason higher against her shoulder again before continuing quietly. At first she tried really hard. A faint sadness entered her expression. She used to make pancakes on Saturdays, and she'd sing Mason to sleep. Daniel listened carefully without interrupting. But then she started crying a lot when she thought we couldn't hear her. Emma stared down at the floor. Sometimes she stayed in bed all day. Another pause. Sometimes she forgot to buy food. The billionaire felt something uncomfortable settle inside him then, because this story suddenly felt less like cruelty and more like someone collapsing emotionally in slow motion. None of it excused what happened, but it made it harder to simply hate her. Emma reached down and unzipped the worn backpack beside her feet. She packed this before we left, she murmured quietly. Daniel glanced inside. A few diapers, 2 juice boxes, crackers, a change of clothes for Mason, and a folded white envelope sitting carefully at the bottom. Emma picked it up slowly. She told me not to open it unless she didn't come back. Daniel felt his chest tighten instantly. The little girl stared at the envelope for several seconds before handing it toward him nervously. Can you read it? For some reason, that request hit Daniel harder than expected, because suddenly the reality of the situation became painfully clear. This child was looking for an adult to take control because she'd been carrying too much responsibility for too long. Daniel carefully unfolded the letter. The handwriting looked rushed and shaky. Emma, if you're reading this, then I've already left. I know you probably hate me right now, and maybe one day you should, but I need you to understand something. I tried. I really did. After your father died, I kept telling myself things would get better. I thought if I worked harder, smiled more, stayed stronger, maybe I could still be the mother you and Mason deserved. But every month things got worse. Bills piled up. I stopped sleeping. Some days I couldn't even recognize myself anymore when I looked in the mirror. Daniel paused briefly. Emma watched his face nervously. He continued reading quietly. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Emma. Neither of you deserve the kind of life I've been giving you. Sleeping in motels, counting grocery money, watching me fall apart a little more every week. I started realizing something terrifying recently. I think I stopped being able to take care of you properly a long time ago. Daniel swallowed slowly before continuing. There's $5,000 inside the side pocket of the backpack. I know it's not enough. I know none of this is enough. But I hoped if I left you somewhere safe, somebody kinder and stronger than me might help you both in ways I no longer can. Emma's eyes filled with tears immediately. Daniel kept reading. Please don't let Mason think I left because of him. He's too young to understand any of this. And Emma, none of this was ever your fault either. I'm just tired. I'm so unbelievably tired. By the time Daniel reached the final line, even he had trouble speaking steadily. I hope someday you can forgive me for being too broken to stay. Mom. Silence settled heavily between them afterward. Even the noise of the airport suddenly felt distant. Emma quickly wiped tears from her face before Mason could notice she was crying. But the toddler already sensed something was wrong. He reached tiny fingers toward her cheek while mumbling sleepily, "Sissy's sad." That was the moment Daniel Mercer felt something inside himself crack open for the first time in years. Because watching a little girl try to stay emotionally strong for a 2-year-old child after being abandoned by the only parent she had left was more heartbreaking than anything money had ever protected him from. Daniel folded the letter carefully before lowering it into his lap. For several seconds, he couldn't speak. Across from him, travelers continued walking through the terminal carrying shopping bags and rolling luggage while boarding announcements echoed overhead like nothing extraordinary had happened. But sitting beside Emma and Mason, Daniel suddenly felt disconnected from all of it. The business meetings waiting for him in Seattle no longer mattered. The conference calls on his phone no longer mattered. For the first time in years, something real had interrupted the carefully controlled routine he'd built around his life. Emma kept staring down at her hands. She used to braid my hair before school, she whispered suddenly. Daniel looked toward her quietly. She wasn't always sad like this. Emma swallowed hard. After Daddy died, she kept saying she'd figure everything out. Her voice cracked slightly, but every month she looked more tired. Daniel didn't know what to say, because grief looked different on everyone. Some people cried. Some became angry. Some disappeared emotionally while still standing in the same room. And apparently, some eventually walked onto airplanes and left their children behind. Mason reached for the teddy bear Daniel bought earlier and hugged it against his chest while blinking sleepily around the terminal. The little boy was too young to understand abandonment fully. All he knew was that his sister was upset, and children always sensed emotional danger faster than adults realized. Daniel leaned back slowly in the airport chair and rubbed one hand across his jaw while thinking carefully. Somewhere inside his jacket pocket, his phone buzzed repeatedly with missed calls from business associates waiting for him in Seattle. He ignored every single one. Then Emma quietly asked the question he realized she'd probably been too afraid to say aloud until now. "What happens to us tonight?" Daniel looked at her. The little girl tried sounding brave when she asked it, but fear still trembled beneath her voice. She wasn't asking about tomorrow or next week. She was asking where she and Mason would sleep in a few hours. And somehow, that reality hit Daniel harder than anything else had so far. Before he could answer, 2 airport security officers returned alongside a woman wearing a navy blue coat with a CPS identification badge clipped near her shoulder. She introduced herself gently as Karen Mitchell before kneeling beside Emma's chair with the kind of careful warmth people used around frightened children. "Hi, sweetheart," she said softly. "I know today's been really scary." Emma nodded weakly while holding Mason closer. Karen glanced briefly toward Daniel before continuing. "The officers explained everything to me." Her expression softened further when she noticed the tear stains still visible on Emma's face. "Right now we just want to make sure both of you are safe, okay?" Emma's first response came immediately. "They're not taking Mason away from me." Karen paused carefully. Daniel noticed the woman choosing her next words very cautiously. "Nobody wants to separate you," she assured gently. But Emma didn't look convinced. Because children who've already been abandoned once stop trusting reassurances very easily. Karen eventually moved to speak privately with the officers several feet away while Daniel remained seated beside the children. He could hear pieces of their conversation quietly drifting across the terminal. No immediate relatives listed. Mother's phone disconnected. Temporary emergency placement. Limited foster availability tonight. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. The idea of Emma and Mason being moved through unfamiliar buildings with strangers after everything they'd already experienced made something inside him deeply uncomfortable. Then he remembered something his late wife used to say years ago whenever they saw stories about abandoned children on the news. "A child never forgets the adult who stayed." At the time, Daniel hadn't understood why those words mattered so much to her. Now he did. Karen eventually walked back toward them carrying paperwork against her chest. "Emma," she asked gently, "do you know if your mother left any family members we can contact tonight?" Emma shook her head slowly. "What about friends?" Another shake. Karen glanced toward Daniel briefly before lowering herself beside Emma again. "Mr. Mercer has offered to help temporarily while we sort everything out." She spoke carefully, almost testing Emma's reaction. "Would you feel comfortable staying somewhere safe with him tonight?" Emma immediately looked toward Daniel. Not hopefully. Cautiously, like someone standing near the edge of a frozen lake trying to decide whether it would hold her weight. "You won't leave us too?" she whispered. The question hit Daniel harder than he expected. Because she didn't ask it dramatically. She asked it quietly, like she already expected disappointment. Daniel leaned slightly forward until their eyes met. "No," he said softly. "I won't." For several seconds, Emma simply stared at him. Then something changed in her expression. Not complete trust. Not yet. But the beginning of it. And somehow that small moment affected Daniel more deeply than million-dollar negotiations ever had. Karen smiled gently afterward. "Okay," she said softly. "Then let's figure this out together." An hour later, Daniel walked through the airport parking garage carrying Mason asleep against his shoulder while Emma walked quietly beside him, holding the worn backpack tightly against her chest. The little girl looked emotionally drained now, moving almost automatically from exhaustion. Daniel slowed his pace slightly so she wouldn't struggle keeping up. Outside, freezing Chicago wind rushed through the parking levels while traffic lights reflected across wet pavement from earlier rain. Daniel opened the back door of his black SUV carefully before helping Emma climb inside. She paused for a second after sitting down, then quietly asked something unexpected. "Are you really rich?" Daniel blinked once before letting out the smallest tired laugh. "I guess so." Emma looked around the luxury vehicle silently. "Mom used to say rich people live in houses bigger than hotels." Daniel glanced toward her in the rearview mirror while starting the engine. Sometimes they do. The little girl lowered her eyes again. Then why do you look sad too? The question caught him completely off guard. For several seconds, Daniel couldn't answer. Because out of everything people said about him over the years, no stranger had ever noticed that part so quickly before. Finally, he looked back toward the rain-covered windshield ahead of them. Sometimes money fixes problems, he said quietly. Then after a pause, he added the truth he hadn't spoken aloud in years. And sometimes it doesn't fix the important ones at all. The drive into downtown Chicago was quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows while city lights blurred across the glass in long streaks of gold and red. Mason remained asleep in the back seat, clutching the stuffed teddy bear against his tiny chest, completely unaware his life had just changed forever inside an airport terminal. Emma sat beside him, holding the worn backpack tightly in her lap, like it contained the last pieces of her old life. Every few minutes, Daniel caught her glancing nervously toward him through the rearview mirror before quickly looking away again. Children who'd been disappointed too many times always watched adults carefully, like they were waiting to see when kindness would suddenly disappear. Daniel understood that more than she realized. After nearly 20 minutes, Emma finally spoke again. "Are we going to a hotel?" Daniel shook his head slightly while keeping his eyes on the road. "No." Emma hesitated, then quietly asked, "Your house?" "Yeah." The little girl fell silent afterward, but Daniel could practically feel the nervousness building inside the car. Truthfully, he understood it. If a stranger had picked him up from an airport at 9 years old claiming everything would be okay, he probably wouldn't trust it either. Outside, downtown skyscrapers rose into the dark, rainy sky, while traffic crawled slowly through evening congestion. Daniel normally hated driving through the city after long flights, but tonight his mind barely registered any of it. Instead, he kept replaying Rachel's letter over and over in his head. "I'm just tired." Those 4 words unsettled him deeply because he recognized them. Not the abandoning part, but the exhaustion, the emotional numbness, the quiet collapse. The feeling of waking up every morning already overwhelmed before the day even began. Daniel had lived inside that darkness himself after his wife died. There were months when he barely remembered entire conversations. Months where work became the only thing stopping him from falling apart completely. The difference was, he'd had money, resources, assistants, therapists, privacy. Rachel apparently had none of those things. And somewhere beneath the anger he still felt toward her, Daniel also felt something else now. Sadness. Not for what she did, but for how broken someone must become before convincing themselves their children might be better off without them. About 40 minutes later, Daniel's SUV finally pulled through the gates of his lakeside property overlooking the outskirts of downtown Chicago. Emma's eyes widened slightly as the massive home came into view through the rain-covered windows. The house looked more like a luxury resort than somewhere a single person lived. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows glowed warmly against the darkness, while soft landscape lights reflected across wet stone pathways outside. Emma stared silently. "People actually live here?" she whispered before she could stop herself. Daniel almost smiled. "Only one person usually." That answer somehow made the enormous house feel sadder. The front doors opened before Daniel even reached them fully. An older woman wearing glasses and a navy sweater stepped into the foyer, looking confused at first, until she noticed the children beside him. "Daniel?" she asked carefully. "This is Margaret," Daniel explained quietly to Emma. "She helps manage the house." Margaret's expression softened instantly the second she saw Mason half asleep against Daniel's shoulder. "Oh my goodness," she murmured gently. "These poor babies." Something about the warmth in her voice immediately relaxed Emma slightly. Margaret knelt carefully in front of her. "Hi, sweetheart." "Hi. You hungry?" Emma hesitated, then nodded. Margaret smiled sadly like she already expected that answer. "I'll make something warm, okay?" The older woman disappeared toward the kitchen while Daniel carried Mason further inside. Emma stepped cautiously across the marble floors behind him while staring quietly around the house. Everything about it felt impossibly large compared to the motels she described earlier. High ceilings, massive windows, soft lighting, expensive furniture untouched by children or family life. The house didn't feel lived in. It felt empty, and honestly, it had been for years. Daniel led them upstairs toward a quiet guest suite overlooking the lake. The room alone was larger than some apartments Emma had probably lived in recently. A neatly made bed sat beside floor-length windows, while soft lamps cast warm golden light across the room. Emma froze near the doorway. "This is for us." Daniel nodded. "You'll both stay here tonight." The little girl looked overwhelmed, almost uncomfortable. Like kindness, this large felt harder to trust than struggle. Daniel carefully lowered Mason onto the bed, without waking him fully, while Emma remained standing near the door, clutching the backpack against her chest. "You don't have to hold on to it so tightly anymore," Daniel said gently. Emma looked down at the bag immediately, then quietly whispered something that made his chest ache again. "It's all we have left." For several seconds, Daniel didn't know how to respond. Because she was right. Everything belonging to their old life fit inside that worn backpack. Margaret returned shortly afterward carrying grilled cheese sandwiches, soup, fruit, and warm milk on a tray. The smell alone made Emma's eyes widen slightly. Daniel noticed the little girl, trying not to eat too quickly once she finally sat down at the small table near the windows. Children who weren't used to regular meals often did that. Margaret noticed too. The older woman quietly looked toward Daniel with concern, while Emma focused on helping Mason eat small bites of sandwich after the toddler finally woke up again. Mason immediately attached himself to Daniel surprisingly fast afterward. At one point, the sleepy 2-year-old waddled directly toward him, holding the teddy bear, before climbing into his lap, like he'd already decided Daniel was safe. The billionaire froze slightly. He couldn't remember the last time a child touched him so casually. Mason rested his head against Daniel's chest while chewing slowly on crackers, completely comfortable now. Emma watched the moment silently from across the room. Then after a while, she asked quietly, "Why are you helping us?" Daniel looked down at the little boy curled against him before answering honestly, "I think somebody should have helped sooner." The room fell silent afterward. Rain continued tapping softly against the massive windows while downtown Chicago glowed in the distance beyond the lake. And for the first time in years, Daniel Mercer's house no longer felt completely empty anymore. Later that night, after Margaret finally convinced Emma to shower and change into clean clothes from the emergency children's items she'd ordered delivered from a nearby store, the house became quiet again. Too quiet. Daniel stood alone in the kitchen staring out through the massive glass windows overlooking the dark lake, while his untouched cup of coffee slowly went cold beside him. Upstairs, he could hear faint footsteps moving around the guest suite every so often. Emma, still awake. He checked the time. 1:17 a.m. Most 9-year-olds would have been asleep hours ago. But Daniel understood something now that many people didn't about children who lived through instability. They rarely slept deeply. Not when life kept teaching them bad things happened at night. Margaret quietly entered the kitchen carrying folded towels before noticing Daniel standing near the windows. "She keeps checking if Mason's breathing," the older woman said softly. Daniel looked toward her immediately. Margaret sighed sadly. "Every few minutes." She lowered the towels onto the counter. "That little girl's been carrying responsibilities far too heavy for her age." Daniel rubbed tiredly at his jaw. "She barely touched the food until he ate first." "I noticed." Silence settled briefly between them. Then Margaret crossed her arms gently before asking the question Daniel already knew was coming. "What exactly are you planning to do here?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "I don't know yet." That was the truth. Everything about today felt unreal. 12 hours earlier, he'd been preparing for another forgettable business trip. Now 2 abandoned children were sleeping under his roof, while CPS prepared investigations and emergency hearings for the morning. Margaret studied him carefully. "You already care about them." Daniel looked away instantly toward the rain outside. "That's dangerous." The older woman's expression softened. "No," she said quietly. "What's dangerous is spending years pretending you stopped needing people." Daniel didn't respond. Because the uncomfortable part was, she was right. Upstairs, Emma sat cross-legged near the edge of the guest bed, while Mason slept beside her hugging the teddy bear tightly against his chest. The oversized t-shirt Margaret gave her hung loosely around her small frame, while damp blonde hair rested against her shoulders from the shower. But she still hadn't unpacked the backpack. It sat beside her untouched, ready to leave at any second. Emma carefully glanced around the unfamiliar bedroom again before looking toward the closed door. Everything still felt temporary. Too clean, too quiet, too safe. She wasn't used to safe anymore. The little girl slowly climbed off the bed before walking toward the giant windows overlooking the lake outside. Chicago's distant skyline reflected across the dark water beautifully, but Emma barely noticed it. Her thoughts kept replaying the same image over and over again. Her mother walking onto the airplane without turning back. At first, inside the airport, Emma thought maybe there'd been some mistake. Maybe her mom forgot something and would run back out of the boarding tunnel apologizing. But deep down, she already knew. The truth was, her mother had started disappearing emotionally months before she physically left. She stopped singing around the motel rooms they stayed in. Stopped smiling at small jokes. Stopped talking about the future. Sometimes Emma would wake up late at night and hear quiet crying from the bathroom while Mason slept beside her. Once, several weeks earlier, she overheard her mother whisper something into a motel phone that frightened her badly. "I don't think I can do this anymore." At the time, Emma pretended not to hear it, because children learned quickly that pretending sometimes kept fragile adults from breaking further. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts suddenly. Emma froze instantly. "Emma." Daniel's voice came gently from outside the room. "You still awake?" The little girl hesitated before slowly opening the door. Daniel stood there holding a folded blanket awkwardly in one hand, like someone completely unfamiliar with comforting children. "I noticed your light was still on," he said quietly. Emma lowered her eyes slightly. "Sorry. You don't have to apologize." Daniel carefully handed her the blanket. "Margaret said the room gets cold near the windows." Emma accepted it softly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel noticed something important immediately. The backpack was still zipped and positioned right beside the bed. "Ready. Always ready. You can unpack your things if you want," he said gently. Emma shook her head almost automatically. That response unsettled him more than he expected, because children who constantly moved from place to place stopped trusting permanence. Daniel leaned lightly against the doorway. "You know, when I was younger, I used to sleep with my suitcase packed too." Emma finally looked up slightly. "Why?" The billionaire stayed quiet for a second before answering honestly. "My father moved around a lot after my parents divorced." He shrugged faintly. "Eventually, I stopped believing we'd stay anywhere long." Emma studied him carefully now. For the first time since meeting him, she looked slightly curious instead of just frightened. "Were you scared too?" Daniel almost smiled sadly. "All the time." Something about hearing a grown man admit that seemed to surprise her. Most adults spent their entire lives pretending fear only belonged to children. Emma looked back towards sleeping Mason. "My mom wasn't bad before Daddy died," she whispered quietly. Daniel nodded slowly. "I believe you." The little girl swallowed hard. "She used to make us birthday pancakes shaped like animals." A tiny broken smile appeared briefly. "They looked terrible." Daniel let out a soft laugh before he could stop himself. Emma noticed, and for the first time all day, she smiled too. Very small, very brief, but real. Then suddenly her expression crumbled again. What if she never comes back? The question hung painfully in the air between them. Daniel looked toward the little girl standing barefoot in the doorway, trying so hard not to fall apart emotionally. And he realized something heartbreaking in that moment. Despite everything, Emma still wanted her mother. Children almost always did. Even after abandonment. Even after disappointment. Even after pain. Daniel carefully crouched slightly so they were eye level. "I don't know what your mom's going through right now," he said softly. "But I do know something important." Emma waited quietly. "None of this happened because of you." The little girl's eyes immediately filled with tears. Because somewhere deep down, that was exactly what she'd been afraid of all along. Emma cried silently that night after Daniel left the room. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just quiet tears sliding down her face while she sat beside Mason's bed holding the blanket tightly against her chest. She tried covering her mouth so her little brother wouldn't wake up and hear her. Because even after everything that had happened, Emma still believed her job was protecting him from fear. Downstairs, Daniel sat alone in the dark living room, unable to sleep. The city lights reflected softly across the lake outside, while Rachel's letter remained folded in his hands. He'd read it 4 times already, maybe more. Each time, the same sentence stayed stuck in his mind. "I'm just tired." For years, Daniel believed money protected people from reaching emotional breaking points. But now he understood exhaustion came in different forms. Some people collapsed inside giant mansions. Others collapsed inside cheap motel rooms with 2 children depending on them. Around 3 in the morning, Daniel finally walked upstairs intending to check whether the children were asleep. But when he quietly opened the guest suite door, he stopped instantly. Emma was awake, curled beside Mason on top of the blankets while holding him protectively against her chest. Even in sleep, she looked tense, like part of her still expected someone to disappear. Daniel stood there silently for several seconds before gently closing the door again. And for the first time in years, the billionaire cried. Not loudly, just quietly enough that nobody else in the house heard him. Because grief recognized grief. And somewhere along the way, Daniel realized the loneliness destroying him and the loneliness destroying those children weren't nearly as different as he once believed. The next morning, sunlight poured through the massive windows overlooking the lake while the smell of pancakes drifted through the house. Emma woke first in confusion, momentarily forgetting where she was. Then reality returned all at once. The airport, her mother leaving. Daniel. Beside her, Mason still slept hugging the teddy bear tightly. Emma carefully climbed out of bed before walking downstairs nervously. She froze halfway down the staircase when she saw Daniel standing in the kitchen trying very unsuccessfully to flip pancakes while Margaret watched with obvious amusement. "You're burning them," Margaret informed him calmly. Daniel frowned at the pan. "I'm aware." Emma accidentally laughed. Both adults looked toward her immediately. Daniel raised the spatula slightly. "Good news," he said seriously. "The kitchen survived." For the first time since arriving, Emma smiled without forcing herself to. And somehow that tiny moment changed the atmosphere inside the house completely. Later that afternoon, CPS representatives arrived alongside family attorneys to discuss temporary custody arrangements. Daniel expected resistance, complications, endless legal obstacles. Instead, after reviewing the situation, the social workers seemed quietly relieved the children had landed somewhere stable after such a traumatic experience. Rachel still hadn't contacted anyone. Her phone remained disconnected. No relatives had stepped forward. Nothing. It was like she vanished completely after boarding that plane. Over the next several weeks, something unexpected began happening inside Daniel Mercer's carefully controlled world. Life returned. Not suddenly. Slowly. Mason started following him everywhere around the house with the tiny, unsteady determination only toddlers possessed. If Daniel walked into the office, Mason followed. If he sat near the fireplace, Mason climbed directly into his lap with books upside down pretending to read beside him. The little boy attached himself emotionally so fast it honestly terrified Daniel at first. Emma took longer, much longer. She thanked people too often, apologized constantly, flinched anytime adults raised their voices unexpectedly. But little by little, she changed too. Margaret enrolled her in a nearby private school, where teachers quickly noticed how intelligent she was despite falling behind academically after months of instability. Daniel hired tutors, bought her new clothes, decorated a proper bedroom instead of a temporary guest suite. Still, Emma kept the backpack, always nearby, always packed. One evening nearly 3 months later, Daniel found her sitting on the floor organizing its contents carefully. "You know," he said gently from the doorway, "you don't have to keep preparing to leave." Emma looked down quietly. Then after several seconds, she whispered the truth. "What if everybody leaves eventually?" The question hit Daniel harder than she realized. Because for years, that exact fear controlled his own life too. He slowly sat beside her on the floor. "When my wife died," he admitted quietly, "I stopped letting people get close because I thought losing them would destroy me again." Emma listened silently. "But being alone didn't protect me either." He glanced toward her carefully. "It just made everything emptier." The little girl looked toward him with tears quietly filling her eyes. Then she asked the question that finally shattered the emotional wall Daniel Mercer had spent 7 years building around himself. "Are we staying?" "Not. Can we stay tonight?" "Not. Can we stay longer?" "Are we staying?" Daniel looked at the frightened little girl sitting beside him clutching the last pieces of her old life inside a worn backpack. Then he answered with complete honesty, "If you want to." Emma burst into tears instantly. Not quiet tears this time. Real ones. The kind children cry when they've been carrying fear too long and finally feel safe enough to let go of it. Daniel pulled her gently into a hug while she cried against his shoulder. And for the first time since his wife died, the house no longer felt haunted by silence. Nearly 8 months later, A family court judge finalized Daniel Mercer's legal guardianship of both children. News of the story had already spread online by then after airport employees anonymously leaked surveillance footage showing Emma sitting alone with Mason near Gate B17. Millions watched it. Millions cried watching it. Especially the moment Daniel first approached the children carrying food and kneeling beside them quietly. People called him a hero afterward. But Daniel hated that word. Because heroes implied extraordinary people. And the truth was much simpler. He just stopped walking. That was all. He noticed two frightened children. Everyone else assumed somebody else would help. And one decision changed all three of their lives forever. As for Rachel, almost a year later, a letter finally arrived. No return address. No explanation for where she'd been. Only a handwritten note. Daniel found Emma sitting quietly near the fireplace reading it with trembling hands while Mason played nearby on the carpet. "What did she say?" he asked gently. Emma wiped her eyes slowly before answering. "She said she's getting help." Daniel sat beside her quietly. The little girl looked down at the letter again before whispering something heartbreaking. "I think part of me was angry because she left." A pause. "But another part of me was scared she never loved us at all." Daniel understood that fear. Emma looked toward Mason laughing nearby with toy airplanes scattered around him. Then she whispered softly. "She said leaving us was the worst thing she's ever done. But she thought staying while falling apart completely would have hurt us even more." Silence settled between them afterward. Complicated. Painful. Human. Because sometimes the hardest part of growing older is realizing broken people can still love deeply and still fail terribly at the same time. That night, after Emma went upstairs to bed, Daniel remained sitting alone near the fireplace, while Mason slept curled beside him on the couch. The little boy shifted sleepily before mumbling one word. "Dad." Daniel froze completely. Mason remained asleep. He didn't even realize what he'd said. But Daniel felt tears suddenly burn behind his eyes anyway. Because somewhere between the airport, the sleepless nights, the pancakes, the fear, the healing, they had already become a family long before paperwork made it official. And maybe that was the real reason this story touched millions of people around the world. Not because a billionaire saved abandoned children, but because three lonely people found each other at the exact moment all of them needed saving too. Before you go, let us know in the comments. Do you think Rachel deserved forgiveness for what she did? And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next emotional true story documentary.